Now, the honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton has a question of privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising on a question of privilege from the Procedure and House Affairs Committee's 63rd report, which was tabled earlier today. While the main thrust of the report concerned the prima facie contempt which the House referred to the committee last year related to foreign interference directed toward the honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills and other colleagues, it is my view that the report lays out grounds for finding a new prima facie contempt, namely that the Minister of National Defence provided misleading evidence to the committee and misleading comments in the House. I should first offer some context, Mr. Speaker. After the House agreed on May 10, 2023, to refer to the committee that question of privilege, sparked by a report in the Globe and Mail based on a July 2021 intelligence assessment, it had come to light through Special Rapporteur David Johnson's subsequently published report that, quote, in addition to the memorandum in question, CSIS sent an Issues Management Note, IMU, to the then Minister of Public Safety, his Chief of Staff, and his Deputy Minister in May 2021, noting that there was intelligence that the PRC intended to target the member for Wellington Halton Hills, another MP, and their family in China, if any, end quote. As the Speaker will recall, having been a member of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee at the time, this led to new areas of important questions for our witnesses, and especially for the Public Safety Minister at the material times. In the portion of the 63rd report summarizing the Minister's appearances before the committee, we may read that the Minister, quote, understands that CSIS authorized the IMU to be shown to him, but he never received it, end quote. The associated footnote in the committee's report points to the Minister's statement responding to one of my questions found at page 22 of the committee evidence for June 1, 2023. Quote, it was determined by CSIS to be shown to me, but they determined, the director determined, that this was not information the minister needed to know, so I was never informed of the existence of that intelligence, nor was it ever shared with me, end quote. On the following page, one may read his further statement when pressed about ministerial responsibility. Quote, this is a situation where it's an operational decision of CSIS as to what information needs to be passed along to government. In this case, they made an operational decision that this was not required. 2 years later, when it was leaked to the press, that information was subsequently shared with me. At the time, I had no knowledge that it existed. I had no knowledge that it was not being shared with me because I wasn't aware that the information was available. CSIS, quite appropriately, made a determination that they didn't believe it was necessary to pass that information along, end quote. The minister's version of events was soon contradicted. Elsewhere in the 63rd report, in the portion summarizing the testimony of CSIS Director David Vineau, we may read that he, quote, told the committee that in May 2021, an IMU was sent from CSIS to the Minister of Public Safety, warning that the member for Wellington Halton Hills and his family were being targeted by the PRC. The IMU included a specific directive that it be forwarded to the Minister. The purpose of the IMU was to highlight the information and bring it to the Minister's attention. When asked whether the information contained in the May 2021 IMU was information that the minister did not need to know, Mr. Vino stated that, quote, "The fact that we didn't issue management note speaks to the notion that we wanted to highlight the information," end of quote, "to the minister," end quote. The associated footnote directs the reader to the following comments by Mr. Vino at page 4 of the evidence for the committee's evening meeting on June 13, 2023, in response to my questions. Quote, "It's also important that when we see we have something of high importance, we have instituted this process called an information management note. That would be shared to bring attention to something more specifically. That was the purpose of this note. It was to bring it to the attention of the people to whom it was destined to go," end quote. Another footnote, Mr. Speaker, points to the following answer at page 7 of the evidence in response to a question from the honourable member for Megantic-Larab. Quote, "As I mentioned a little earlier, CSIS and I conveyed the information to the Department of Public Safety along with the very specific directive to forward it to the minister. It's important for the committee to understand that we shared the intelligence and the briefing note," end quote. Yet in spite of this, the minister doubled down on his position. During question period on June 14, 2023, the day following Mr. Vino's committee appearance, in response to a question from his coalition partner, the honourable member for Burnaby South, the minister said at page 15,981 of the debates, quote, "Mr. Vino did not send his note to me," end quote. Suffice to say, Mr. Speaker, there was no, quote, "operational decision," which was, quote, "appropriately made or otherwise by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service to keep the Minister of Public Safety in the dark about a serious matter of national security, namely the threats from a foreign government directed toward a senior and long-serving member of the House of Commons." But this analysis doesn't rely exclusively on the evidence of Mr. Vino. According to the 63rd report, the minister's then Deputy Minister, Rob Stewart, quote, "did not recall of an operational decision not to inform the minister about the IMU," end quote. More pointedly, Mr. Speaker, the IMU in question has been released by CSIS under the Access to Information Act and was subsequently tabled by Conservatives at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. The committee has made reference to its possession of the IMU in the following comment at footnote 98 of the 63rd report. Quote, "The committee notes that in documents that it received, the May 2021 CSIS IMU was sent to the minister, his deputy minister, and his chief of staff," end quote. A copy of the publicly released version of the IMU has, for good measure, been annexed to the Conservatives' supplemental opinions in the 63rd report so that the House is seized with a copy of it. While the document is heavily redacted, it is still plain to see on its face in two separate locations, quote, "Distribution is confined exclusively to DM Public Safety, Minister Public Safety, Min PS, COS, NSIA," end quote. Recall that the minister said here on the floor of the House that this note was not sent to him. The facts are clear, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of National Defence misled the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and he misled this House. Page 82 of House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, notes among established grounds of contempt, quote, deliberately attempting to mislead the House or a committee by way of a statement, evidence, or petition, end quote. Similar comments can be found on pages 153 and 1081, for example. As explained in numerous speakers' rulings to establish a prima facie contempt in respect of deliberately misleading statements, 3 elements must be made out. First, it must be proven that the statement in question was misleading. Second, it must be established that the person making the statement knew at the time that it was misleading. And third, in making the statement, it must be established that the statement was offered with the intention to mislead. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, from the evidence which I have cited, that the statement was misleading. As for the other 2 elements of that test, I think the correct analysis is the following one. On its face, the minister's testimony is frankly absurd. Why would CSIS issue an IMU to the Minister on Intelligence about which an operational decision had been made not to share it with him? This defies common sense and lacks all credibility. After the minister was caught out on this deception, he appeared before the committee a second time on October 24th, 2023, and offered this weak explanation. Quote, I assumed that if the director did not share information with me, then he didn't require that I see it, end quote. Without more, we are not satisfied with the minister's explanation. Not only was the minister's assumption incorrect, it was, I would submit, a faulty one too. Certainly the minister was in no place to speak so authoritatively or with such conviction that CSIS had, quote, made an operational decision to keep him in the dark. The minister used very specific words. He was unequivocal in his words. Moreover, the minister made the claim repeatedly. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, it is evident his choice of clear, convincing, and unequivocal wording was deliberate. He showed no hesitation. He did not shade his words with doubt or otherwise represent that he was speaking on the basis of assumption. Put simply, he did not misspeak. He actively misled the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and he actively misled this House. As Mr. Speaker Milliken stated on February 1, 2002, at page 8,581 of the debates, quote, the authorities are consistent about the need for clarity in our proceedings and about the need to ensure the integrity of the information provided by the government to the House, end quote. The integrity of information here, too, is in doubt. To this, it is worth adding the words of one of your predecessors from a ruling delivered March 3, 2014, at page 3,430 of the debates. Quote, this incident highlights the primordial importance of accuracy and truthfulness in our deliberations. All members bear a responsibility, individually and collectively, to select the words they use very carefully and to be ever mindful of the serious consequences that can result when this responsibility is forgotten, end quote. What is serious here is that these exchanges at committee appear to have been meant to deflect from the shocking fact that the Minister of Public Safety, as he was, through his own inaction and omission, was unaware of intelligence concerning the targeting of a senior and long-serving member of Parliament by a hostile foreign state, intelligence which CSIS had specifically sent to him as a matter of high importance. This constituted a serious breakdown in the flow of information and intelligence under this minister's watch. As the minister, he bore responsibility for this breakdown. Instead of accepting responsibility, the minister deflected blame to the director of CSIS for a supposed operational decision that had been made to keep him in the dark. The minister had to have known that no such operational decision had been made, and yet he said so anyway. The minister had a duty to be truthful in his testimony to the committee. He was not truthful. He misled the committee in a self-serving attempt to evade accountability for a massive failure that occurred under his watch as Minister of Public Safety. Misleading a parliamentary committee is a serious matter. Indeed, it can be a contempt of Parliament. That it was a minister of the Crown who did so makes this even more grave. It simply cannot be overlooked. Indeed, as Mr. Speaker Milliken ruled on November 6, 2023, at page 9,229 of the debates, quote, "However tempting the invitation, the Speaker cannot presume to articulate the expectations that committees have of witnesses who come before them. Suffice to say that I believe all honourable members will agree with me when I say simply that committees of the House, and by extension the House of Commons itself, must be able to depend on the testimony they receive, whether from public officials or private citizens. This testimony must be truthful and complete. When this proves not to be the case, a grave situation results, a situation that cannot be treated lightly." End quote. On February 1st, 2002, after concerns about the statements of another Liberal Minister of National Defence, Mr. Speaker Milliken found a prima facie case of privilege, commenting at page 8,582 of the debates, quote, "I have concluded that the situation before us, where the House is left with two versions of events, is one that merits further consideration by an appropriate committee, if only to clear the air." End quote. Similarly, your predecessor ruled on March 3rd, 2014, at page 3,431 of the debates, that a prima facie case of privilege existed because, quote, "The fact remains that the House continues to be seized of completely contradictory statements. This is a difficult position in which to leave members who must be able to depend on the integrity of the information with which they are provided to perform their parliamentary duties. Accordingly, in keeping with the precedent cited earlier, in which Speaker Milliken indicated that the matter merited, quote, further consideration by an appropriate committee, if only to clear the air, end quote, I am prepared in this case for the same reason to allow the matter to be put to the House, end quote. In the present case, the House again is possessed of two versions of events by virtue of the 63rd report. Before concluding, Mr. Speaker, I should note that while the statements of concern were made last spring, the matter is actually being raised in the House at the earliest opportunity. I would refer the Chair in that regard to Mr. Speaker Milliken's February 10, 2011 ruling on page 8,030 of the debates, quote, "The Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader was not mistaken in his assertion that any and all statements made in committee, even when those have been repeated verbatim in the House, remain the business of the committee until such time as it elects to report them officially to the House. This is a long-standing practice. Furthermore, while a copy of an internal CETA document obtained through an access to information request was provided to me, it was not tabled in the House and thus is not officially before it. It may sound overly technical, but the reality is that when adjudicating cases of this kind, the chair is obliged to reference material fully and properly before the House. With regard to statements made by the minister, this material is limited to a few questions, to oral questions, and one answer to a written question, not to any comments in committee, end quote. A week following that ruling, the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade presented its 6th report, which referred to the committee testimony in question, as well as providing a copy of a document obtained through the access to information process. On the strength of this information, with which the House had become seized, Mr. Speaker Milliken found a prima facie case of privilege on March 9, 2011, at page 8,842 of the debates. The same circumstances prevail here, with the 63rd report now placing properly before the House the necessary evidence to make out the relevant tests for the question of privilege I am raising. Should the Speaker agree with me that the air, again, needs to be cleared because the current Minister of National Defence appears to have committed contempt by deliberately misleading the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, I am prepared to move the appropriate motion to task that committee with assessing this specific problem and reporting its views back to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you for the interjection.